So we are ready for chapter 5. The end of the great barn was piled high with new hay, and over the pile hung the 4-talon Jackson fork suspended from its pulley. The hay came down like a mountain slope to the other end of the barn, and there was a level place as yet unfilled with the new crop. At the sides, the feeding racks were visible, and between the slats, the heads of horses could be seen. It was Sunday afternoon. The resting horses nibbled the remaining wisps of hay, and they stamped their feet, and they bit the wood of the mangers and rattled the halter chains. The afternoon sun sliced in through the cracks of the barn walls and lay in bright lines on the hay. There was the buzz of flies in the air, the lazy afternoon humming. From outside came the clang of horseshoes on the playing peg and the shouts of men playing, encouraging, jeering. But in the barn, it was quiet and humming and lazy and warm. So he always starts off with this setting the tone, which sometimes supports the action and sometimes contradicts the action that's going to happen. In the very first chapter, we had a very bucolic opening, that very beautiful kind of scenic sense. And then we sort of had the horror of these homeless men who were trying to find work and had been run out of weed. So here we are starting with a sense of great quiet. And he has wonderful rhetoric here. The barn, it was quiet and humming and lazy and warm. So this repetition of the word and, it's called polysyndeton, poly meaning many, syn meaning to bring things together, synthesize. So polysyndeton, the sense of stacking items up. So it's quiet and humming and lazy and warm. So you have this sense of these adjectives kind of stacking up and creating something bigger than themselves. And so everything is leading you towards this sort of quiet and peace. Only Lenny was in the barn, and Lenny sat in the hay beside a packing case under a manger in the end of the barn that had not been filled with hay. Lenny sat in the hay and looked at a little dead puppy that lay in front of him. Lenny looked at it for a long time, and then he put out his huge hand and stroked it clear from one end to the other. And Lenny said softly to the puppy, "Why, you got to get killed. You ain't so little as mice. I didn't bounce you hard." He bounced a puppy. He bent the pup's head up and looked in its face, and he said to it, "Now maybe George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits if he finds out you got killed." He scooped a little hollow and laid the puppy in it and covered it over with hay out of sight. But he continued to stare at the mound he had made. He said, "This ain't no bad thing, like I got to go hide in the brush. Oh, no, this ain't. I'll tell George I find it dead." He unburied the puppy and inspected it, and he stroked it from ears to tail. He went on sorrowfully, "But he'll know. George always knows. He'll say, 'You done it. Don't you try to put nothing over on me.' And he'll say, 'Now just for that, you don't get to tend no rabbits.'" Suddenly, his anger rose. "God damn you," he cried. "Why you got to get killed? You ain't so little as mice." He picked up the pup and hurled it from him. He turned his back on it. He sat bent over his knees and he whispered, "Now I won't get to tend the rabbits. Now he won't let me." He rocked himself back and forth in his sorrow. From outside came the clang of horseshoes on the iron stake, and then a little chorus of cries. Lenny got up and brought the puppy back and laid it on the hay and sat down. He stroked the pup again. "You wasn't big enough," he said. "They told me you wasn't. Well, I didn't know you'd get killed so easy." He worked his fingers on the pump's limp ear. Maybe George won't care, he said. This here goddamn little son of a bitch wasn't nothing to George. Interesting things here. We have not seen this kind of cursing from Lenny before. And Lenny is not putting it in a place where a person normally would curse. He's not using it to express anger or disgust. So he's using curse words the way a child would. He's mimicking adults without really understanding what's going on. But we've not seen Lenny curse like this before. So this is a little bit new for him. Curly's wife came round the end of the last stall. She came very quietly so that Lenny didn't see her. She wore her bright cotton dress and the mules with the red ostrich feathers. Her face was made up and the little sausage curls were all in place. She was quite near to him before Lenny looked up and saw her. In a panic, he shoveled hay over the puppy with his fingers. He looked sullenly up at her. She said, "What you got there, sonny boy?" Lenny glared at her. "George says I ain't to have nothing to do with you. Talk to you or nothing." She laughed. "George giving you orders about everything?" Lenny looked down at the hay. "Says I can't tend no rabbits if I talk to you or anything," she said quietly. "He's scared. Curly'll get mad." "Well, Curly got his arm in a sling, and if Curly gets tough, you can break his other hand. You didn't put nothing over on me about getting it caught in no machine." But Lenny was not to be drawn. "No, sir, I ain't going to talk to you or nothing." She knelt down in the hay beside him. "Listen," she said. "All the guys got a horseshoe tenement going on. It's only about 4 o'clock. None of them guys is going to leave that tenement. Why can't I talk to you? I never get to talk to nobody. I get awful lonely." Gee, is that, I don't know, a chronic problem on this ranch that everyone is lonely? Does it occur to you if all these people who are lonely started being kind to each other and talking to each other, there'd be less loneliness? Yes? And yet none of them will. So, ironically, she too is lonely. Lenny said, "Well, I ain't supposed to talk to you or nothing." "I get lonely," she said. "You can talk to people, but I can't talk to nobody but Curly, else he gets mad." "How'd you like to not talk to anybody?" Lenny said. "Well, I ain't supposed to. George is scared I'll get in trouble." She changed the subject. "What you got covered up there?" Then all of Lenny's woe came back to him. "Just my pup," he said sadly. "Just my little pup." And he swept the hay from on top of it. "Why, he's dead," she cried. "He was so little," said Lenny. "I was just playing with him, and he made like he was going to bite me, and I made like I was going to smack him, and I done it, and then he was dead." She consoled him. "Don't you worry none. He was just a mutt. You can get another one easy. Whole country is full of mutts." "It ain't that so much," Lenny explained miserably. "George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits now." "Why don't he?" "Well, he said if I done any more bad things, he ain't gonna let me tend the rabbits." She moved closer to him, and she spoke soothingly. "Don't you worry about talking to me. Listen to the guys yell out there. They got $4 betting that tenement. None of them ain't going to leave till it's over. If George sees me talking to you, he'll give me hell," Lenny says cautiously. "He told me so." Okay, does anyone see the irony that Lenny keeps talking to her in order to tell her that he's not supposed to talk to her? It's very possible that giving Lenny directions is not very useful because he doesn't really have enough intellect to be able to understand how to carry those directions out. She changed, sorry. Lost my page. Had to go let the dogs out, so now I got to figure out. Ooh. Her face grew angry. "What's the matter with me?" she cried. "Ain't I got a right to talk to nobody? What they think I am, anyways. You're a nice guy. I don't know why I can't talk to you. I ain't doing no harm to you." "Well, George says you'll get us in a mess." "Aw, nuts," she said. "What kind of harm am I doing to you? Seems like they ain't none of them cares how I gotta live. I tell you, I ain't used to living like this. I could have made something of myself." She said darkly, "Maybe I will yet." And then her words tumbled out in a passion of communication, as though she hurried before her listener could be taken away. Ooh, one more person who desperately wants someone to listen to them. And Lenny becomes that perfect person to listen. And so, just like Crooks, she's going to rush to tell her story. "I lived right in Salinas," she said. "Come there when I was a kid. Well, a show come through, and I met one of the actors. He said I could go with the show, but my old lady wouldn't let me. She says because I was only 15, but the guy says I coulda. If I'd went, I wouldn't be living like this, you bet." Oh, think about that. There was a show, and an adult man told her that she was good enough, pretty enough, talented enough to be an actress, and she should come with them. Y'all do know why adult men would say something like that to a 15-year-old child, correct? She's a victim. She was used. And yet she doesn't understand that, because she says that if she had gone with that man, she wouldn't be living the way she is, that she'd be an actress. She'd have a good life. She doesn't understand that people were trying to use her. Lenny stroked the pup back and forth. "We're going to have a little place and rabbits," he explained. She went on with her story quickly before she should be interrupted. "'Nother time I met a guy, and he was in pictures." Movie pictures? Yeah, right. Went out to the Riverside Dance Palace with him. He says he was going to put me in the movies. Says I was a natural. Soon as he got back to Hollywood, he was going to write to me about it. Absolutely, because Hollywood producers are always going to, dance barns in the middle of nowhere, finding girls. And she doesn't understand, because he was going to write to her. So couldn't possibly be that he was trying to get in her pants. She looked closely at Lenny to see whether she was impressing him. "I never got that letter," she said. "I always thought my old lady stole it." "Well, I wasn't going to stay no place where I couldn't get nowhere or make something of myself, and where they stole your letters." What are the odds her mother stole her letter? Probably thinking it's more likely the man never sent it. He got what he wanted from a child. Because remember, very second chapter, Candy referred to her as jailbait, which means she's not 18 yet. So however old she was when this producer from Hollywood crawled in her bed, she definitely wasn't 18. This is a child who's been taken advantage of. "I wasn't going to stay no place where I couldn't get nowhere or make something of myself, and where they stole your letters. I asked her if she stole it too, and she says no. So I married Curly. Met him out at the Riverside Dance Palace that same night." She never loved Curly. She married him because she was mad at her mother. Not the most mature reaction. She demanded, "You listening?" "Me? Sure." "Well, I ain't told this to nobody before. Maybe I oughtn't to. I don't like Curly. He ain't a nice fella." And because she had confided in him, she moved closer to Lenny and sat beside him. Could have been in the movies, and Had nice clothes, all them nice clothes like they wear. And I could have sat in them big hotels and had pictures took of me. And when they had them previews, I could have gone to them and spoken the radio, and it wouldn't have cost me a cent because I was in the picture. And all them nice clothes like they wear. Because this guy says I was a natural. She looked up at Lenny and she made a grand gesture with her trailing arm and hand so that she could act. The fingers trailed after her leading wrist and her little finger stuck out grandly from the rest. Lenny sighed deeply. From outside came the clang of horseshoe on metal and then a chorus of cheers. Somebody made a ringer, said Curly's wife. Now the light was lifting as the sun went down, and the sun streaks climbed over the wall and fell over the feeding racks and over the heads of the horses. Lenny said, maybe if I took this pup out and throwed him away, George wouldn't never know, and then I could tend the rabbits without no trouble. Curly's wife said angrily, don't you think of nothing but rabbits? We're going to have a little place, Lenny explained patiently. We're going to have a house and a garden and a place for alfalfa, and that alfalfa is for the rabbits, and I take a sack and I get it all full of alfalfa, and then I take it to the rabbits. She said, what makes you so nuts about rabbits? Lenny had to think carefully before he could come to a conclusion. He moved cautiously close to her until he was right against her. I like to pet nice things. Once at a fair, I seen some of them long-hair rabbits, and they was nice, you bet. Sometimes I've even pet mice, but not when I could get nothing better. Curly's wife moved away from him a little. I think you're nuts, she said. No, I ain't, Lenny explained earnestly. George says I ain't. I like to pet nice things with my fingers, soft things. She was a little bit reassured. Well, who don't? She said. Everybody likes that. I like to feel silk and velvet. Do you like to feel velvet? Lenny chuckled with pleasure. Oh, you bet by God. And he cried happily. And I had some too. Oh, lady, give me some. And that lady was my own Aunt Clara. She gave it right to me, about this big a piece. I wish I had that velvet right now. A frown came over his face. I lost it, he said. I ain't seen it for a long time. Curly's wife laughed at him. You're nuts, she said, but you're kind of a nice fella, just like a big baby, but a person can see kind of what you mean. Just when I'm doing my hair sometimes, I just set and stroke it, 'cause it's so soft. To show how she did it, she ran her fingers over the top of her head. Some people got kind of coarse hair, she said complacently. Take Curly. His hair is just like wire, but mine is soft and fine. Of course, I brush it a lot. That makes it fine. Here, feel right here. She took Lenny's hand and put it on her head. Feel right round here and see how soft it is. Lenny's big fingers fell to stroking her hair. Don't you muss it up, she said. Lenny said, oh, that's nice. And he stroked harder. Oh, that's nice. Look out, now you'll muss it up. And then she cried angrily, you stop it now, you'll mess it all up. She jerked her head sideways, and Lenny's fingers closed on her hair and hung on. Let go, she cried. Let go. Lenny was in a panic. His face was contorted. She screamed then, and Lenny's other hand closed over her mouth and nose. Please don't, he begged. Oh, please don't do that. George will be mad. She struggled violently under his hands. Her feet battered on the hay, and she writhed to be free. And from under Lenny's hands came a muffling screaming. Lenny began to cry with fright. Oh, please don't do none of that, he begged. George gonna say I done a bad thing. He ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits. He moved his hand a little, and her hoarse cry came out. Then Lenny grew angry. "Now don't," he said. "Well, I don't want you to yell. You're going to get me in trouble just like George says you will. Now you don't do that." And she continued to struggle, and her eyes were wild with terror. He shook her then, and he was angry with her. "Don't you go yelling," he said, and he shook her, and her body flopped like a fish. And then she was still, for Lenny had broken her neck. He looked down at her, and carefully he removed his hand from her mouth, and she lay still. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, "but George will be mad if you yell." When she didn't answer nor move, he bent closely over her. He lifted her arm and let it drop. For a moment, he seemed bewildered. And then he whispered in fright, "Oh, I done a bad thing. I done another bad thing." He pawed up the hay until it partly covered her. From outside the barn came a cry of men and the double clang of shoes on metal. For the first time, Lenny became conscious of the outside. He crouched down in the hay and listened. "I done a real bad thing," he said. "Well, I shouldn't have did that. George will be mad." And he said, and hide in the brush till he come. He gonna be mad in the brush till he come. That's what he said. Lenny went back and looked at the dead girl. The puppy lay close to her. Lenny picked it up. "I'll throw him away," he said. "It's bad enough like it is." He put the pup under his coat, and he crept to the barn wall and peered out between the cracks toward the horseshoe game, and then he crept around the end of the last manger and disappeared. The sun streaks were high on the wall by now, and the light was growing soft in the barn. Curly's wife lay on her back, and she was half covered with hay. It was very quiet in the barn, and the quiet of the afternoon was on the ranch. Even the clang of the pitched shoes, even the voices of the men in the game seemed to grow more quiet. The air in the barn was dusky in advance of the outside day. A pigeon flew in through the open hay door and circled and flew out again. Around the last stall came a shepherd bitch, lean and long with heavy hanging dugs. Halfway to the packing box where the puppies were, she caught the scent of Curly's wife, and the hair rose along her spine. She whimpered and cringed to the packing box and jumped in among the puppies. Curly's wife lay with a half covering of yellow hay, and the meanness and the plannings and the discontent and the ache for attention were all gone from her face. She was very pretty and simple, and her face was sweet and young. Now her rouged cheeks and her reddened lips made her seem alive and sleeping very lightly. The curls, tiny sausages, were spread on the hay behind her head, and her lips were parted. As sometimes happens, a moment settled and hovered and remained for much more than a moment. And sound stopped, and movement stopped for much, much more than a moment. So Lenny was holding a hand, he was petting her hair, and he got his fingers tangled in her hair. And when she yelled, he put a hand over her mouth. So when he shook her, he was literally shaking her head, which is why her body was flopping like a fish. And yet, even after he had broken her neck, he was still yelling at her to be quiet. You have to be quiet. He doesn't understand death, not really, but he does understand he did a bad thing. And of the two murders in that barn, which one does he choose to cover up? In today's court system, the fact that he chooses to cover up the death of the puppy and not the death of Curly's wife would suggest that he is not competent to stand trial, that that he is not mentally old enough to really be held culpable of murder. So he might be institutionalized, but he wouldn't be put in prison. Back then, first of all, the punishment for murder, specifically murder of a woman, would be far more likely death. But the other thing is there was no compassion for disability. And I think you've seen that multiple times in the book. So nobody's going to have compassion for the fact that Lenny doesn't understand what he did. If he's powerful enough to kill a woman, they're going to treat him like a full-grown man who understands what he did. Okay, so the barn grew still and quiet, and time stopped for a moment. Then gradually time awakened again and moved sluggishly on. The horses stamped on the other side of the feeding racks, and the halter chains clinked. Outside, the men's voices became louder and clearer. From around the end of the last stall, old Candy's voice came. "Lanny," he called. "Oh, Lanny, you in here? I've been figuring some more. Tell you what we can do, Lanny." Old Candy appeared around the end of the last stall. "Oh, Lanny," he called again. And then he stopped and his body stiffened. He rubbed his smooth wrist on his white stubble whiskers. "I didn't know you was here," he said to Curly's wife. When she didn't answer, he stepped nearer. "You oughtn't sleep out here," he said disapprovingly. And then he was beside her and, oh, Jesus Christ. He looked about helplessly and he rubbed his beard. And then he jumped up and went quickly out of the barn. But the barn was alive now. The horses stamped and snorted, and they chewed the straw of their bedding, and they clashed the chain of their halters. In a moment, Candy came back, and George was with him. George said, "What was it you wanted to see me about?" Candy pointed at Curly's wife. George stared. "What's the matter with her?" he asked. He stepped closer, and then he echoed Candy's words. "Oh, Jesus Christ." He was down on his knees beside her. He put his hand over her heart, and finally, when he stood up, slowly and stiffly, his face was as hard and tight as wood, and his eyes were hard. Candy said, "What done it?" George looked coldly at him. "Ain't you got any idea?" he asked, and Candy was silent. "I shoulda knew," George said hopelessly. "I guess maybe way back in my head I did." Think about it. You went from killing mice to killing a puppy to killing a girl. He went from grabbing a girl and terrifying her, making her think she was going to be raped, to grabbing a girl and accidentally killing her. Lenny's violence has been steadily escalating. And so George is looking back saying, "Ah, crap, I should have known." Candy asked, "What we gonna do now, George? What we gonna do now?" George was a long time in answering. "Guess we gotta tell the guys. Guess we gotta get him and lock him up. We can't let him get away. Why, the poor bastards starve." And he tried to reassure himself. "Maybe they'll lock him up and be nice to him." But Candy said excitedly, "We ought to let him get away. You don't know that Curly. Curly's going to want to get him lynched. Curly get him killed." George watched Candy's lips. "Yeah," he said at last. "That's right. Curly will, and the other guys will." And he looked back at Curly's wife. Now Candy spoke, his greatest fear. "You and me can get that little place, can't we, George? You and me can go there and live nice, can't we, George? Can't we?" Before George answered, Candy dropped his head and looked down at the hay. He knew. George said softly, "I think I knowed from the very first. I think I knowed we'd never do her. He used to like to hear about it so much I got to thinking maybe we would." "Then it's all off?" Candy asked sulkily. George didn't answer his question. George said, "I'll work my month and I'll take my $50 and I'll stay all night in some lousy cat house or sit in some pool room till everybody goes home, and then I'll come back and work another month and have another $50 more." Candy said, He's such a nice fella. I didn't think he'd do nothing like this. George still stared at Curly's wife. Lenny never done it in meanness, he said. All the time he done bad things, but he never done one of 'em mean. He straightened up and looked back at Candy. Now listen, we got to tell the guys they got to bring him in, I guess. There ain't no way out. Maybe they won't hurt him, he said sharply. I ain't going to let him hurt Lenny. Now you listen. The guys might think I was in on it. I'm going to go in the bunkhouse. Then in a minute, you come out and tell the guys about her. And I'll come along and make like I never seen her. Will you do that? So the guys